Arthur's Family Truth. I had just stepped out onto the porch when the caretaker grabbed my arm hard enough to stop me cold. He didn't look at me, just said under his breath, "Don't drink anything they give you." I was already awake. I'd barely slept. My name is Arthur Donovan. I'm 67 years old, retired private investigator out of Memphis, Tennessee. 30 years reading people for a living, liars, fraudsters, people who could look you dead in the eye and tell you the sky was green. I was good at spotting them, but the one that nearly got me was the one I raised. Let me back up 5 days. My wife Gloria passed 2 years ago. Official cause, accidental fall down the stairs. Middle of the night. Paramedics said it was quick. That was supposed to help. It didn't. After 38 years of marriage, the house got real quiet. I'd sit at the kitchen table in the morning with my coffee and just listen to nothing. So when my son Cliff called about 3 weeks ago saying he'd bought a property up near Lake Chattooge in the Appalachian foothills of Georgia and wanted me to come stay a while, I said yes. Said he wanted to reconnect, spend some real time together. I wanted to believe him. What else was I going to do, sit in Memphis staring at Gloria's empty chair? I drove down on a Tuesday. The farmhouse was something else. Big, fully renovated, sitting on a hillside above the lake with a long porch, stone fireplace, views that cost serious money. More money than a consulting business should produce. I noticed that. Old habit. His wife Sandra met me at the door. Blonde, always put together, smile practiced enough that you had to look twice to see it didn't reach her eyes. She handed me a glass of iced tea before I'd even set my bag down. That first evening Cliff poured me a bourbon on the porch. I drink 1 glass most nights, always have, going back to my working days. We sat watching the sun go down over the water. Almost felt like something could be repaired between us. I noticed the caretaker out near the tree line. Older man, broad shoulders, trimming back some overgrowth with slow, deliberate movements. He glanced over once, then turned back to his work. "Who's that?" I asked. "Norman," Cliff said. "Comes with the property, keeps the grounds, watches the place when we're not here." I nodded and didn't think more about it. "One thing you should know about me, I never learned to swim properly. Always meant to fix that. Never did." Cliff had known since he was a kid, watching me wave him off toward the deep end at the community pool while I stayed in the shallow water. I mention this now because it matters later. That first night I slept heavier than I had in months. I figured it was the long drive. Next morning I woke slow, head stuffed with something that wasn't quite a headache. Drank coffee, walked the property, felt better by noon. That evening Sandra set my bourbon on the side table before I asked. Said she remembered I liked it and wanted me to be comfortable. I thought that was thoughtful. I woke the following morning with no memory of the previous evening. Not a gap, not fuzzy, gone, a complete blank from somewhere around 8 p.m. onward. I lay there going through it the way you'd work a timeline on a case. Nothing came. My watch read 9 to 22 a.m. I haven't slept past 6 in 20 years. Downstairs, Cliff was at the kitchen table with his phone already in his hand. He looked up at me with this careful, patient expression, the kind I'd seen before on people who already know the answer to the question they're about to ask. "How are you feeling, Dad? What happened last night?" I said. He frowned like I'd said something sad. "We had dinner. You told some stories, went to bed early. You okay?" Then he turned his phone toward me. Video. Me sitting at the dinner table holding a wine glass. I don't drink wine. I never drink wine. Talking with my words sliding together, eyes not quite focused. I looked confused. I looked old. I barely recognized myself. "I've been a little worried," Cliff said quietly. "The memory stuff, the confusion. Maybe worth seeing someone, Dad." He let that sit. 30 years of reading liars, and I felt it hit, that specific gut-level alarm. Not loud, just steady. The same feeling from the middle of a case when a story didn't line up. I told him I was fine and went back upstairs. Stood by the window. Down below, Norman was working near the rose beds. He stopped, looked up at the window for just a second, then went back to his shears. That was day 3. The knock came on day 5, before the sun was up. I opened the door and got my first clear look at him, broad-shouldered, gray-haired, holding his hat in both hands. "Norman Webb," he said. "I take care of the grounds here. We haven't spoken directly, but I've been watching since you arrived, Mr. Donovan. And what I found, you need to see it before your son gets back." He handed me a folded sheet of paper. Lab results from a private certified lab in Atlanta, run by a contact of his from his years as county sheriff. He told me he'd been watching Sandra at the bar cart through the kitchen window 2 evenings back and had seen her tip something into my glass from a small bottle before carrying it out. He'd swapped the glass for a clean one, sent the original sample overnight. I unfolded the paper and read the line he'd circled: zolpidem tartrate, sleeping medication. Nearly 3 times the maximum safe dose per serving. I stood there in the doorway for a moment without saying anything. They've been doing it every night, Norman said. Your son records you on his phone when you get foggy. He's building a case to have you declared mentally incompetent. Gloria, I said. Before she died, was she? I don't know yet, Norman said. But I think we need to find out. He stepped inside and closed the door behind him. We sat at the small table by the window, the lake barely visible in the gray pre-dawn light. He laid out what he knew and what he needed. He'd already contacted a former FBI colleague, a woman named Patricia Marks, based out of Atlanta. She was aware of the situation and ready to move. But she needed more before anyone could act. Documents, recordings, Cliff on record doing something that couldn't be explained away in court. Norman's plan was simple. He'd swap out my bourbon each evening before Sandra got to it, clean glass, no drug, so I'd stay fully alert. I'd keep playing confused. Let them believe it was working. Meanwhile, Norman would keep digging. I'm a retired investigator. I know what it means to run a slow case. You don't move until you have what you need. So I said yes. The next several days were the strangest of my life. Every evening I'd sit at dinner and give them what they expected. Slow responses, blank stares in the middle of a sentence, repeating a question I'd asked 20 minutes earlier. Cliff would lean forward with that patient, concerned expression and ask me things I pretended not to remember. Sandra would refill my glass and watch me the way someone watches a dial they've been waiting to move. Cliff kept his phone face up on the table every single night, always recording. Meanwhile, Norman was working. He got into Cliff's office one morning while the two of them drove into town for supplies. The door had a basic pin tumbler lock, the kind a county sheriff learns to handle in his first year on the job. He was inside in under a minute. In the filing cabinet, he found a thick manila folder. Inside, a completed petition for legal guardianship, dated for the following week, my name at the top. Age 67, declared mentally incompetent due to progressive cognitive decline. There was a printed record of incidents, dates, times, descriptions of my supposed confusion, with Cliff listed as the witness on every single entry. Underneath that was a letter on medical letterhead, Dr. Irving Sloan, neurologist, Gainesville, Georgia. The letter stated that I had been formally evaluated and diagnosed with early-stage Alzheimer's disease, and that immediate guardianship was recommended to protect my assets and personal welfare. I have never been to Gainesville. I have never sat across from Dr. Irving Sloan. The letterhead was clean and professional. The signature looked real. It was a forgery, and a careful one. There were bank statements, too. Cliff was $280,000 in debt across 3 accounts. Sandra had 95,000 euros in credit card balances she'd kept separate. Together, that was 375,000 euros in the hole. They'd bought this farmhouse to flip it, and the market had moved against them. My house back in Memphis was worth $620,000, free and clear. My retirement accounts on top of that. The math wasn't complicated. Norman photographed every page and put the folder back exactly as he'd found it. 2 days after that, he found the boathouse. It sat at the edge of the property near the waterline, weathered wood, shingled roof. Looked like somewhere you'd store a couple of kayaks and some fishing gear. But it had a padlock on it that belonged on a commercial storage unit. Heavy gauge steel, hardened shackle. Norman got it open. Inside, floor-to-ceiling stacked cardboard boxes with medical supply labels printed on the sides. He opened several counterfeit surgical instruments, fake branded diagnostic equipment, packaging designed to pass as legitimate medical supply orders. Mixed in among the boxes were smaller cartons of controlled substances, opioids mislabeled and repackaged. A contact of Norman's with federal experience put the total street value at roughly $4 million. Cliff hadn't stumbled into financial trouble and gotten desperate. He'd built a supply operation. The farmhouse, once he controlled it through my guardianship, gave him a rural base he could run goods through and distance himself from legally. If things ever went sideways with law enforcement, the property deed would point to a 67-year-old man with documented cognitive decline who couldn't even testify reliably in his own defense. That was the full picture. Not just my money, I was the shield. Norman installed a small camera inside the decorative clock above the fireplace. FBI grade, his words, the size of a coat button. Everything said in that living room from that point forward went to a secure off-site feed. Patricia Marks was monitoring it remotely. Sheriff Eugene Briggs, who Norman had known for 15 years, was coordinating with 2 of his deputies on standby. About a week into the surveillance, Cliff came home one afternoon with a man in a gray suit carrying a leather briefcase. He introduced him as a notary, said there was some routine financial paperwork that would help protect my assets. Basic stuff shouldn't take 10 minutes. The notary's hands were slightly unsteady when he opened the briefcase. I noticed that the document he slid across the table was a full durable power of attorney transfer, naming Cliff as my sole financial agent with immediate authority over all accounts and real property. That is not routine paperwork, that is everything. I told them I was tired and my head was hurting and I needed to rest before I put my name on anything. Gave them the slow blink, the confused pause. Cliff pushed, calm, measured, the way someone pushes when a deal needs to close before questions start. I'd seen that exact pressure applied in dozens of interview rooms over 3 decades. I knew what it meant. After they left, I went upstairs and waited. That evening, Norman relayed the notary visit to Patricia Marks. She told him that was enough to begin formal proceedings, but she still needed Cliff to move first. On record, his own words, 4 days later, Cliff asked me to go out on the boat. Just the 2 of us, he said. Get some fresh air, spend some time on the water. His voice was easy, relaxed. Sandra stood in the kitchen doorway behind him with her arms crossed and didn't say anything. That morning, Norman pulled me aside near the garden shed while Cliff was inside on a call. He kept his voice low and his back to the house. "Don't go out there without this," he said, and handed me a jacket, dark blue, waterproof. He'd sewn a GPS tracker into the collar lining and fitted a button camera into the chest, angled outward. The feed went live the moment I zipped it up. "I'll be behind you in the smaller boat," he said, 100 yards back, out of sight. "Patricia and Briggs will have eyes on the feed from shore." He paused. "Arthur, if anything feels wrong out there, you say the word anchor. Just that word. I'll be alongside you in under 2 minutes." I told him I understood. "One more thing," Norman said. "I need you to know Cliff grew up watching you stay out of the deep end at that community pool. He knows you can't swim." I don't think this boat trip is about fresh air. I already knew that. I'd known it from the moment Cliff suggested it. We pushed off from the dock just after 2 in the afternoon. The lake was flat and gray-green, the hills on the far bank dark with pine. Cliff ran the engine steady and didn't talk much on the way out. He seemed relaxed in the way people seem relaxed when they've already made a decision and are just waiting for the right moment to act on it. About a quarter mile from shore, he cut the engine. We drifted. The silence came in fast, just water against the hull and the distant sound of birds from the tree line. "Beautiful out here," Cliff said. He wasn't looking at the view. I looked down. A thin line of water was creeping across the floor of the boat, moving toward my feet. Slow at first, then I watched it widen. "Cliff," I said, "we're taking on water." He didn't move. "Cliff, the boat's leaking. We need to head back." He looked at me then, and his face was completely still. Not worried, not surprised. Just calm in the way a man is calm when he's past the point of going back. "I know, Dad," he said quietly. "I'm sorry. I really am." He said he'd cut the fuel line before we left the dock, said the whole drain plug was out, said he'd watched me for the past 2 weeks pretending not to notice things, asking questions through Norman, going through his office, said I'd left him no choice. I told him there was always a choice. He said not when you're $375,000 under, and the only way out is standing right in front of you. The water was at my ankles now, cold even through my boots. The boat was listing slightly to the left. I reached for the side rail to steady myself, and Cliff took 1 step back, just one deliberate to put distance between us. "You never learned to swim," he said. It wasn't a question. I didn't answer. I moved toward him and the boat lurched as the water shifted weight. And I lost my footing and went over the side. The cold hit me like a wall, knocked the air clean out of my chest. I broke the surface gasping and went under again before I could get my bearings. The jacket was heavier than I'd expected. The equipment in the lining dragged on me, and I couldn't find anything solid to push against. I kicked hard and got my face above water for 1 second, and then the weight pulled me back down. A hand closed around my collar from above and yanked hard. Norman. He had me under the arms and was pulling with everything he had, hauling me toward his boat. I grabbed the hull with both hands and he got me over the side and I collapsed onto the floor of the smaller boat, coughing up half the lake, chest heaving, unable to speak. "Stay down," Norman said. He was already turning the motor toward shore. By the time we reached the bank, Sheriff Eugene Briggs was standing on the grass with 2 deputies. Patricia Marks was behind them, phone in hand, earpiece in. Cliff had followed in the sinking boat, paddling with his hands when the hull went too low to run. He came ashore about 40 yards down the bank and stood there wet and breathing hard, looking at the deputies and then at me and then at Norman. He didn't run. I'll give him that. Briggs walked toward him slowly, the way a man walks when he's got nowhere to be and all the time in the world. "Mr. Donovan," Briggs said. "Patricia's team has audio and video from the last 20 minutes. Your exact words on record. You want to tell me the boat malfunctioned?" Cliff looked at me one more time. His expression wasn't anger. It wasn't fear either. It was something emptier than both of those, like a man who had already calculated every exit and found none of them open. He didn't say anything. The deputies moved in. Sandra was arrested at the farmhouse 40 minutes later. 2 packed suitcases sitting open on the bed. I sat on the bank wrapped in a blanket Briggs handed me and watched them load Cliff into the back of the patrol car. He didn't look over at me, not once. That was the moment I understood something I'd been trying not to understand for the past 2 weeks. The man in that car wasn't someone who'd gone wrong recently. This had been building for a long time, probably since before Gloria died, probably long before I'd ever driven down that gravel road to Lake Chachooge. Patricia sat down next to me on the bank. "We have everything," she said. "The camera, the GPS track, the audio from the boat, the forged Sloan letter, the guardianship petition, the boathouse inventory." She paused. "There's one more thing I want to pursue, Arthur. But it's your call." I already knew what she was going to say. She wanted to exhume Gloria. I sat on that bank, with the blanket around my shoulders and the lake still dripping off me, and I didn't say anything for a long moment. A kingfisher cut across the water about 20 yards out, hit the surface, and was gone. "The same method," Patricia said quietly. "Zolpidem in a drink, administered over time. The fall would be consistent with someone who couldn't feel the ground under their own feet. If we test bone marrow, we can detect it even 2 years out." She let that sit. "It's your decision. I won't push." I thought about the last morning I'd seen Gloria. She'd been standing at the kitchen counter in Memphis pouring her tea. The kind she drank every morning. The one Cliff had started bringing over in those last few months, because he said he'd found a blend she'd like. She'd waved me off toward the door, told me to drive safe. I'd had a 3-day job in Nashville and I kissed her on the cheek and I left. I never came home to her again. "Do it," I said. Patricia filed the petition with the county court the following morning. The judge approved it 9 days later. The forensic team went to the cemetery on a Thursday. I didn't watch. I sat in Norman's cabin and drank coffee and waited. While we waited, Norman found the diary. He'd been working through the garage, cataloging the property contents for the asset documentation Patricia's team needed. My old metal toolbox was on the bottom shelf, the one I'd had since I was 24 years old, beat up red steel with a broken latch I'd never fixed. I'd left it at Gloria's because she'd always used it more than I had. Norman opened it to log it and found a leather-bound notebook tucked underneath the socket set, wrapped in a plastic grocery bag. He brought it to me without opening it. Gloria's handwriting on the inside cover. I recognized it from 38 years of birthday cards and grocery lists and notes left on the kitchen counter when she went to bed before me. She'd hidden it there because she knew. She knew Cliff would go through the house after she was gone. She knew he'd look through drawers and closets and boxes. But she also knew he'd never opened that toolbox. He'd never once touched it his entire life. He had no interest in anything that required working with your hands. She'd known her own son, and she'd known what he was capable of before I did. I read it at the table in Norman's cabin with the door closed. The early entries were ordinary thoughts about the garden, a movie she'd watched, a phone call with her sister. Then they changed. January 2023, about 3 months before she died. She wrote that Cliff had come by while I was traveling, asked about the will, asked specific questions about account balances and property values, said when the time came, everything would go to him anyway, so why not start planning now? She wrote, the way he said it made my skin go cold. I've never seen that look on his face before. A month later, she wrote that she'd been dizzy for several days. that the tea tasted different, but she couldn't say how exactly, that she'd almost missed the bottom step twice in 1 week, that she was frightened but didn't know who to tell because she didn't want to be wrong about her own son. The last entry was 11 days before she fell. Arthur, if you find this, please know I tried to figure out how to tell you. I didn't want to believe it, I still don't, but something is wrong, and I'm scared, and I don't know how much time I have to write this down. Don't let it go. Please, I love you. I'm so sorry I didn't say it out loud. I sat with my hands flat on the table for a long time after I finished reading. I didn't cry. I just sat there and breathed, and let it settle into me like something that had always been true, and had finally stopped hiding. She had been alone in that house, afraid, trying to protect me from something she hadn't fully named yet. And I had been in Nashville working a fraud case for a client I can't even remember anymore. The lab results came back 6 weeks after the exhumation. Patricia called me while I was sitting on Norman's porch watching the water. Zolpidem tartrate in the bone marrow. Concentration consistent with repeated high-dose exposure over several weeks. The forensic pathologist's report stated that at that level of accumulation, significant loss of balance and spatial awareness would be expected. The fall was consistent with involuntary incapacitation. It was not an accident. The trial ran 3 weeks in July. Prosecutor Carol Caldwell was methodical and patient and very good at her job. She put everything in front of the jury in order: the lab results from my bourbon, the forged Dr. Sloan letter, the guardianship petition, the boathouse inventory, the boat footage with Cliff's voice clear on the audio, Gloria's diary read into the record in full, and the bone marrow report. Russell Kane, a federal agent who'd been tracking the counterfeit medical supply network for several months, testified about the scope of Cliff's operation and his role running it out of the farmhouse. Norman testified about what he'd seen Sandra do at the bar cart. He was calm and precise on the stand, the way a man is calm when he spent 30 years giving testimony and knows exactly what a jury needs to hear. I testified on the 3rd week. Carol asked me to describe the boat. I described it. She asked me what Cliff said when the water came in. I told the jury his exact words. I said them without looking at the defense table. The jury came back in just under 5 hours, guilty on all counts. Cliff received life without the possibility of parole for Gloria's death, plus 20 years for the trafficking operation. Sandra received 28 years. The judge read the sentences without drama. The courtroom was quiet. I didn't feel relief. I didn't feel satisfaction. I felt the specific weight of something that has been finished, not fixed, not restored, just finished. Gloria was still gone. That wasn't going to change. But it didn't go unanswered. That part I could live with. The farmhouse came back to me through asset forfeiture, cleared and transferred by late September. I drove out to Lake Chechuge on a Tuesday morning, same day of the week I'd first arrived, which I noticed but didn't make anything of. Norman was on the porch steps when I pulled up. The lake was still behind the house, the hills already starting to turn at the edges. He stood when he saw me and we shook hands without saying anything for a moment. Then I told him what I wanted to do with the property: a resource center, a safe house. Somewhere for older men and women who were being targeted by their own families, people who needed legal help, a place to stay, somebody who knew the signs and wasn't going to tell them they were imagining things. I wanted to call it the Gloria House. Norman looked out at the water. His jaw worked slightly the way it did when he was holding something in. "I'd like to run security and operations," he said finally. "If you'll have me?" That's exactly what I had in mind. We sat on that porch for a while after that, not talking much, watching the light move across the lake. 2 old men who had been through something that changes a person whether they want it to or not. There's no clean lesson at the end of this. What I know is what I always knew. I just forgot to apply it where it mattered most. If something feels wrong, it probably is. The instinct that kept me working for 30 years didn't fail me here. I talked myself out of listening to it. Because the alternative was believing something I didn't want to believe about my own son. Don't do that. Whatever it cost you to face the truth early, it cost less than facing it late. The Gloria House opened the following spring. Norman runs it the way he ran his department. Quietly, seriously, and without a lot of unnecessary words. Gloria would have liked that. Blood doesn't make a person safe to trust. Character does. And character shows itself long before the crisis. You just have to be willing to look. The people most likely to take everything from you are the ones who already know where you keep it, and the ones you never thought to lock the door against.